to new friends.
I don't find them that pleasant to be around.
This Friday,
I guarantee you won't want to leave.
Speak No Evil is filled with teeth-clenching, seat-clawing suspense.
Something's not right with him.
I've always wanted a family like yours.
James McAvoy will scare you speechless.
Oh! You're gonna kill us.
We're just sad to see you go.
Speak No Evil. Rated R. Under 17, not admitted without parent. Only in theaters Friday.
This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. So far, we've covered that first spark of the Satanic Panic with the doctor-patient relationship between Dr. Pazder and Michelle Smith, a relationship that resulted in the groundbreaking book, Michelle Remembers, a book that chronicled the 14 months of intensive treatment where Michelle was able to unlock memories from her past. Painful and disturbing memories of satanic ritual abuse at the hands of a sex cult that had been operating in Victoria, British Columbia for generations. Then, the disturbing string of preschool satanic abuse cases that saw thousands of young victims and hundreds of arrests across the country starting in the early 1980s. Many of these cases featured staff trained in new techniques that helped to identify signs that children were, in fact, being abused by Satanists. The book, Michelle Remembers, was often one of the training tools, along with Dr. Pazder himself serving as a consultant to several law enforcement agencies. Then things got the federal treatment with the formation of the Parents Music Resource Center, the PMRC, which successfully lobbied Congress to pass legislation that required music with lyrics deemed detrimental to young listeners be tagged with a warning sticker to help parents make better choices. Those warning stickers have stuck around and are still an unavoidable component of the music industry to this day. It seems all that was left was for the mainstream media to throw their hat into the ring. So, they did. Not just local news media, but also, yes, all local news media. No, this crisis required two of the biggest names in media during the 1980s to swoop in and save the day: Geraldo Rivera and Oprah Winfrey. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to Back to School, a history of the Satanic Panic, Part 4.
Whether a Satan exists is a matter of belief, but we are certain that Satanism exists. To some, it's a religion. To others, it's the practice of evil in the devil's name. It exists, and it's flourishing. Members of our studio audience tonight will attest to that. They are friends and foes of Satanism, devil worshippers and law enforcers, experts and victims. They'll help us understand this force that exalts evil and darkness. We'll be asking why. Why does it exist? And why does it appeal to so many vulnerable people, especially the young? Now, the very young and the impressionable.
Geraldo Rivera was born in 1943 and grew up in Brooklyn, New York. His father was Spanish and his mother was an Ashkenazi Jew. Although his dad was a Roman Catholic, Geraldo was, according to him, raised mostly Jewish, including being bar mitzvahed at age 13. He attended the Maritime College in the Bronx before transferring to the University of Arizona, where he was considering a business career. But that didn't seem like a good fit, and before long, he was back in New York and enrolled at the Brooklyn Law School, where he graduated near the top of his class in 1969. As an attorney for the Puerto Rican activist group, the Young Lords, Rivera caught the eye of a local TV news producer who offered him a job. Soon after, Geraldo Rivera found himself working in the field where he would make his name: broadcast journalism. As a reporter for ABC News in New York, Rivera quickly proved that he was the real deal and won a Peabody Award for excellence in journalism just 3 years later. With his star on the rise, he became a frequent guest on the national ABC shows, 2020 and Nightline. He was the first to air a national segment that used the word AIDS to identify what was then a terribly misunderstood infectious disease. His work on behalf of educating the world about AIDS only raised his profile further. And Rivera wasn't afraid to rock the boat. when his network president refused to air an expose about Marilyn Monroe and John and Bobby Kennedy, Geraldo called him out for his close ties with the Kennedys and questioned his journalistic integrity. Geraldo was fired because of it. His career, though, wasn't without other missteps. His famous 2-hour special, The Mystery of Al Capone's Vaults, which was a live special that followed the discovery and live reveal of what the notorious gangster Al Capone had hidden away in secret vaults beneath a hotel in Chicago. The big surprise? Was it money? Gold? Corpses of his enemies? No. It was absolutely nothing. I remember watching it as a kid and wondering how in the hell a major network could have allowed it to happen. Wasn't there any way they could have, saved us all a few hours and done a little pre-investigation? I think the only thing of substance, literally of substance, something that was still recognizable as an artifact, was an empty, maybe like a clear glass wine bottle. That was it. Anyway, the Al Capone's Vaults disaster was in 1986, and as you might have guessed, Geraldo needed a comeback story. But before we get to Geraldo's next obsession, I have a question. How many of you out there are old enough to remember daytime TV of the 1980s? Because if you do, then you'll remember the wonderful era of so-called trash TV. Before Geraldo Rivera became the crusading face of the anti-Satanic movement in America, he was courting controversy every day on his daytime talk show, Geraldo. His main competitor was none other than Morton Downey Jr., the undisputed king of TV shit-talking and troublemaking. But Geraldo's show made him famous, and one incident in particular put him into the stratosphere. So Geraldo would often court controversy on his show. He would platform truly despicable people in order to boost ratings, and on one fateful day, he invited avowed racists and anti-Semites to, talk things over with a group of black and Jewish activists. It quickly degenerated into a small-scale riot in the TV studio.
The reason why I do that is because I get sick and tired of hearing the sob stories from I get sick and tired of seeing Uncle Tom here sucking up, trying to be a white
Go ahead, Roy, go ahead. Now, let me tell you.
Sit down.
You gotta be kidding. You gotta be kidding. You gotta be kidding. Hey, hold it. Hold it.
Sit down.
In a stroke of marketing genius, news of the melee, quote, leaked in the weeks leading up to the airing of the episode. Along with the news were pictures of a badly broken nose that Geraldo received when someone threw a metal chair into the middle of the scrum, and it became the highest rated daytime show up to that point. But that was just his day job, and the success of that day job made it possible to go after the big fish with full network approval and funding. And what was that big fish? That's right. Geraldo went into full crusader mode when it came to the Satanic Panic. He had his finger on the skyrocketing pulse of the American baby boom generation, who had become convinced in recent years, due to the success of books like Michelle Remembers, movies like The Exorcist and the Amityville Horror, and criminal cases regarding preschools, they were convinced that devil worshippers were hiding in the shadows virtually everywhere. Geraldo Rivera made it his mission in the late 80s and early 90s to expose these people and bring them to justice. He would talk to Catholic priests.
Father LeBar, you investigate these cases for the Catholic Church. Is it the Church's position that demonic possession is possible?
It certainly is. There have been many cases down through the centuries, many in our own decade, for example, of where the devil has actually possessed people and caused them to do many strange things.
So you believe it's possible?
I believe not only is it possible, it is a reality in some very select amount of cases.
He would challenge heavy metal stars.
Let's go to London for a quick exchange with Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy, I'm glad you're on the program. I'll interview you in greater detail in a couple of minutes. The one thing I have to ask you now, though, is, of course, the vast majority of your fans and the fans of heavy metal music are not Satanists. But there is no doubt, at least not in our reporting, that heavy metal music plays a role. Every single kid whose case we know about, who committed a violent act in Satan's name, was also into heavy metal music. What's your response to that, Oz?
Well, I don't really know. All I do is make music. You know, I don't sit down and purposely plan to freak everybody out. I mean, I always have played heavy metal music. I suppose when I was younger and I started writing songs, my world was kind of dark and dingy. You know, I came from a working class family who had nothing, no dough, no prospect of ever having much money, and so that's how I saw the world as a child. And so, not all my songs are about Satanism.
Of course not.
In fact,
He even took his show on the road to a little town you may have heard of.
As reporters investigating this story for months, we have a good idea of what's going on in this country. Our big question tonight is why. This is Detective Sergeant Pearl Hart. Yes, stand up, Paul. He's the man, the cop who investigated the Tommy Sullivan tragedy. I've never heard of wounds that ferocious, and the pictures are even more appalling. Pictures that we did not show here. Do you think, you're not a theologian, you're a cop, do you think that Tommy was possessed?
I think that possession is a state of mind, and it would have been a hell of an interview with Tommy had we located him. Certainly, like I had said before, his death was as violent as his mother's.
And Geraldo was a ratings machine. Not only could he boast the highest rated episode of daytime TV in history, now he had the highest rated made-for-TV documentary in history, with his smash hit, Devil Worship, exposing Satan's underground.
The Investigative News Group presents the Geraldo Rivera Special. Devil Worship. Exposing Satan's underground.
The show did as much to scare the shit out of parents as it did to inform them of what to watch out for when it came to their kids possibly entertaining an interest in Satanism or the occult. And he went full Geraldo in the 2-hour special, which happened to air in primetime. Now, back in the 80s, that first hour of primetime TV from 8 to 9 p.m. was widely considered to be the family hour, the time when the majority of children were still awake for at least part of that hour and were usually in front of the TV along with their parents. That's when you'd catch shows like Alf or The Cosby Show, programming that was considered 4-quadrant. It would be acceptable to anybody in the family who happened to be watching. Geraldo and the network knew this, and there were several admonitions to, quote, get the kids out of the room or turn the channel before this next segment. At one point, Geraldo was practically begging parents to shield their kids from what was about to be presented on national television. He then went on to explain that he and his team had discovered the possibilities that babies were being bred for the sole purpose of ritual sacrifice to the devil. And for the kids who survived that terrible fate, well, they had a gruesome existence of near continuous sexual abuse, also used as an offering to the Dark Lord. Geraldo also described what might seem like a run-of-the-mill cocktail party, with the notable difference being those martini glasses were filled with human blood. Now, Geraldo was sure to couch all these allegations with phrases like, could actually be happening, or according to reports. but the information was delivered with such force and with such an incredibly urgent and ominous sense of doom that the already high level of panic people were experiencing in this country increased exponentially. And remember, it wasn't just stories. Geraldo had actual Satanists with actual victims to point to if anyone dared doubt the veracity of his claims.
Because I want to get to Sean Sellers, who's the youngest kid ever to go on death row in Oklahoma. Sean is a kid who murdered his mother, murdered his stepfather, murdered a convenience store clerk. What did Satanism have to do with it, Sean? What did Satan, do you feel, have to do with, first, your murder of that convenience store clerk?
Satanism was, well, the murder was because it was a, how do I say this so that you can understand it? It was a sacrifice to prove allegiance to Satan, to prove my hatred towards society and everything.
Well, hatred towards society is one thing, Sean, but how does Satan make you commit murder? As we've seen, the level of violence in these crimes committed in Satan's name is often appalling and savage, brutal enough to shock even hardened police officers. Detective Paul Hart thought he had seen everything. Then this veteran New Jersey officer saw how a suburban teenager murdered and mutilated his own mother.
I believe that evil will once again rise and conquer the love of God. If this pact is to your approval, sign below.
Just barely 14 years old, Tommy Sullivan had written this contract with the devil before he butchered his mother with his Boy Scout knife. The murder took place in the basement of the Sullivan family home.
As we came down here, we found Mrs. Sullivan laying on the floor just about in this area here.
Describe the condition of the body.
It appeared that her throat had been cut and a good portion of her face had literally been slashed away. Tommy died as brutally as his mother did, but at his own hands.
What did Tommy then manage to do to himself? What wounds did he inflict on himself to kill himself?
His first self-inflicted wounds were a series of wounds to his wrists, 3, if I remember correctly, deep enough to actually sever the arteries and the tendons in his arm, enough to snap back his wrist. And after doing that, he literally slit his throat from ear to ear with this 3.5-inch knife from the windpipe all the way back to the spinal column, and to the point of almost taking his head off.
Understandably unable to live with the gruesome memories in their family, Tommy's father and younger brother have moved out of state.
Do you think you can ever find it in your heart to forgive your son?
I don't know. I loved him dearly. But he also took my wife, who I loved.
How could this happen here? To a nice boy from a good Catholic school and a fine middle-class family. Sure, he was obsessed by the symbols. This is what his room looked like on the night of the murder and suicide. But heavy metal is not answer enough.
You're a veteran of Vietnam. Had you ever seen anything that brutal?
Certainly in an area like this, in a town like this, in a neighborhood like this, you don't expect to see that type of violence. And it was brutal. It was brutal, and there's few of us that will forget that.
Nor do you forget these drawings Tommy made just before he killed himself. But you continue to search for the reasons. What made Tommy? What made the others do it?
That second clip there was Geraldo talking to Detective Paul Hart, the lead investigator in the Tommy Sullivan murder-suicide in Jefferson Township in 1989. Geraldo crossed the river to the Jersey side and set up on Tommy's front lawn to report on the ritualistic satanic murder of his mother and eventually himself on a snowy night in January. But it wasn't just the star power of Geraldo Rivera shining its light into the shadows of Satanism. His daytime counterpart, Oprah Winfrey, got in on the act.
My next guest was used also in worshiping the devil, participated in human sacrifice rituals and cannibalism. She says her family has been involved in rituals for generations. She is currently in extensive therapy, suffers from multiple personality disorder, meaning she's blocked out many of the terrifying and painful memories of her childhood. Meet Rachel, who is also in disguise to protect her identity. You come from generations of ritualistic abuse?
Yes. My family has an extensive family tree, and they keep track of who's been involved and who hasn't been involved. and it's gone back to like 1700.
And so you were...
Right. I was born into a family that believes in this.
And does everyone else think it's a nice Jewish family? From the outside, you appear to be a nice Jewish girl.
Definitely.
And you all are worshiping the devil inside the home?
Right. There's other Jewish families across the country. It's not just my own family.
Really?
The subject even reached the height of journalistic integrity with the segment on 60 Minutes.
To describe this story as horrifying would be an understatement. And if that sounds like a warning, then that's exactly what it's meant to be. It deals with the sexual abuse of children by satanic cults. And not only that, human sacrifices as well. We started investigating these secret satanic cults when a British Member of Parliament linked them with the ritual murder of children. In this day and age, it sounded too far-fetched, as did suggestions that the same thing might be happening in Australia. But then we met Teresa. She's only 15, and for 12 of those years, she's been the victim of relentless depravity. Teresa's story is both shocking and compelling, yet it's a story she's anxious to tell. But again, we should warn you that parts of this report may be distressing.
So now, thanks to some of the world's most recognizable journalists and media pop culture figures, everyone was aware of the great looming threat that Satanism represented. It was no longer a boogeyman from the movies or something conjured in the imagination sitting around a campfire. The threat was real. No longer just the obscure specters deep in the woods of rural America. It had now arrived on the doorstep of many American families in the form of their own children. How were the powers that be supposed to stop it? Where could they even begin? Find out next week as our History of the Satanic Panic continues. Thanks for listening. Please make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and now full episodes available on YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Danny Abelson. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.